They asked us what we became, as if the answer could fit inside a sentence. As if a species could cross the dark between stars, outlive its wars, bury its dead, survive its own nightmares, and still be explained with a word simple enough to satisfy the comfortable. We became many things. We became late-night prayers whispered over dying fires. We became the hand that did not let go. We became the voice in the storm saying, "Not yet." We became hunger with a direction. We became grief that learned how to build. We became the species that looked at an empty sky and did not see emptiness at all. We saw distance. We saw challenge. We saw a door. And then we opened it. You know us now as diplomats, engineers, admirals, poets, terraformers, peacekeepers, medics, monsters, legends. You know us by the names history gave us after we survived long enough to deserve history. But that is not where we began. We began in mud. We began in cold. We began with stone in our hands and fear in our throats. We began surrounded by teeth sharper than ours, claws stronger than ours, winters crueler than our bodies were built to endure. We began as prey that refused to accept the category. That was our first miracle. Not intelligence, not fire, not language. Defiance. Before we understood the stars, before we learned mathematics, before we wrote laws or epics or names for our gods, we learned one impossible thing, that the world could say no, and we could answer anyway. That is the oldest thing in us. The first human who stood against the dark was not brave because they believed they would win. They were brave because they were cold and frightened and mortal, and they stood anyway. They stood with trembling hands and a heartbeat full of panic and chose, for one more night, not to disappear. And when one stood, others stood with them. That was our second miracle. We did not survive because we were the strongest. We survived because we gathered. Because somewhere in the oldest winters, in the oldest nights, around the first weak circles of fire, we made a choice stranger than violence and harder than fear. We chose each other. A hurt child was lifted. A tired hunter was fed first. A dying elder was listened to. A story was told one more time so that memory would outlive flesh. This is what the galaxy never understood about us when it first began to measure our species. They measured our weapons and missed our funerals. They measured our expansion and missed our lullabies. They measured our aggression and missed the impossible tenderness that made our aggression meaningful. They thought our history was forged in conquest. They were wrong. Our history was forged in care. Every empire we built and broke, every machine we made sing, every ship we launched into silence, every law we wrote in the hope of becoming better than our instincts, all of it came from that first impossible decision to keep one another alive. Even now, beneath the polished speeches and the star charts and the flags, beneath the fleets and treaties and old political theater of civilized existence, that ancient choice still lives in us. Choose each other. Again. 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 That is what we became. Not perfect. Never that. We became dangerous before we became wise. We split the atom before we mastered our anger. We mapped the genome before we learned how to stop drawing borders around suffering. We reached orbit carrying all the old ghosts of the ground below. We brought our hatreds with us. Our greed, our vanity, our talent for turning difference into division and fear into doctrine. We did terrible things with the same hand that once lifted the weak from the snow. This too is part of the truth. A legend that hides its scars is propaganda. A species that lies about its darkness learns nothing from surviving it. So no, we were not noble all the way through. We were not clean. We were not chosen by destiny or blessed with moral clarity. We failed each other more times than memory should forgive. We built camps and cages and battlefields. We invented elegant words to excuse ugly deeds. We prayed over peace and profited from war. We crowned tyrants. We followed them. We buried the evidence and called the silence order. There were centuries when the best thing about humanity was not what we were, but what some among us refused to let us remain. Remember them. Remember the ones who stood when standing was costly. Remember the ones who spoke when silence was safer. Remember the ones who hid strangers, fed enemies, broke unjust laws, crossed oceans, crossed fire, crossed the old poison lines to say, no farther. Civilization did not survive because evil was weak. Civilization survived because courage was contagious. One person said no. Another heard. Then another. And somehow that was enough to begin. History changes like that, not always with thunder, not always with banners. Sometimes it changes because in one room, at 1 hour no one will record, somebody chooses decency. When cruelty would have been easier. That choice echoes. We are living inside those echoes still. And then there was the sky. Ah, the sky. The oldest wound and the oldest promise. For most of our history it was beyond us, bright with indifference. We put our gods there because we could not put ourselves there. We filled it with myths because our hands could not yet touch it. We stared upward from deserts and coastlines and frozen plains and ruined cities, and we asked the same question in 10,000 different tongues. What is waiting for us out there? The answer for a very long time was silence. But silence has never discouraged our kind. It has only ever made us louder. So we built towers, then engines, then wings of metal, then fire beneath capsules, then stations, then ships. Every generation moved the horizon a little farther back, and every generation was told by someone wiser, richer, older, or more afraid that enough was enough. Every generation ignored them. That is another thing we became. We became the refusal of limits imposed too early. When gravity said stay, we said watch. When distance said impossible, we said calculate again. When vacuum said die, we said then teach us how to live there. We crossed the threshold not because we were ready, but because readiness is a myth invented by those who confuse caution with destiny. No one is ready for the future. They build the means to meet it, and they go. So we went. First to orbit, then to the moon, then outward slowly at first like children learning the shape of a house they did not know was theirs. We stumbled. We lost ships. We made graves in places no wind will ever touch. We learned how expensive wonder could be. And still we went. Because something in us had recognized a pattern long before we had words for it. The unknown may kill us, but the cage will finish the job. So we chose the unknown. That choice remade us. A species born on one world cannot remain mentally small forever if it survives seeing another sunrise from somewhere else. Once you have watched your home become a blue light in a sea of black, nationalism begins to look embarrassingly provincial. Hatred begins to look inefficient. Vanity begins to look small. Not gone, never gone, but smaller. Space did not make us saints. It made us honest. Out there, stripped of pretense, life revealed its real terms. Air mattered, water mattered, trust mattered, competence mattered. The person beside you mattered. Reality did not negotiate. Vacuum did not care about ideology. Radiation could not be persuaded. Distance did not respect pride. And so slowly, painfully, imperfectly we changed. Not because enlightenment descended upon us. Because necessity did. We became collaborative because isolation killed us. We became inventive because failure killed us. We became patient because the stars do not reward haste. We became guardians because fragility, once understood, changes the soul. The first generation born beyond Earth did not ask whether humanity belonged among the stars. They asked a stranger question. If we belong everywhere now, what do we owe everything? That question was the hinge on which our species turned. Until then, survival had been our great project. After that, stewardship became possible. We began to heal worlds instead of merely occupying them. We learned to terraform without erasing, to build cities that listen to landscapes, to enter ecosystems as students before claiming to be architects. We made laws not only for citizens but for rivers, forests, weather systems, coral shelves, microbial oceans, and unborn generations whose names we would never know. Too slowly, yes. Too late for some worlds, yes. But we learned. And learning for our kind is a form of repentance. Do you understand now why the old stories called us relentless? It was never just that we kept fighting. It was that we kept changing. That is far more dangerous. Violence is common in the universe, so is ambition, so is fear. Transformation is rare. Most civilizations become what survival first required of them and remain there until their own rigidity breaks them. Predators remain predators. Hierarchies harden. Systems repeat themselves so long they begin to mistake repetition for wisdom. But us, we mutate morally. Pain teaches us, and if the lesson is not learned by one generation, it stalks the next. We archive our failures. We dramatize them. We sing them. We legislate around them. We build memorials large enough to shame the future. We drag our dead with us, not as chains, but as witnesses. There are species older than ours. Species stronger. Species more elegant, more disciplined, more internally harmonious. But there are very few who can do what we do after catastrophe. Begin again without becoming the same. That is our great terrifying gift. Break us and we study the fracture. Burn us and we learn the chemistry of fire. Bury us and our children return with better tools. We do not merely endure history. We metabolize it. And because we do, we became something the early galaxy did not know how to classify. Not conquerors, though we could conquer. Not saints, though sometimes we produced them. Not survivors, though survival is tattooed into every layer of our civilization. We became witnesses with agency. We became memory that acts. We became a species capable of looking directly at the worst thing it had ever done and saying, "This will not be the final shape of us." Do not misunderstand me. We are still dangerous. We still possess the old instincts. Give us fear, scarcity, humiliation, and enough lies, and the old machinery wakes quickly. The beast has not died. It has been taught manners, educated, burdened with history, surrounded by law, watched by conscience, but it still lives in the basement of the human soul. That is why we must remain vigilant. A legend is not something you achieve once and keep forever. A legend is a debt. Every generation must decide whether it intends to deserve the inheritance it was given. Every era asks us the same question in a new language. Now that you have survived, now that you have built, now that you are powerful, who will you be? Not what will you own. Not how far will you spread. Who will you be? Because power does not reveal character, it tests maintenance. Who are you when you can afford cruelty? Who are you when you can justify indifference? Who are you when the stranger at your gate has nothing to offer but need? Who are you when revenge is available, profitable, and popular? Those answers define a species more than any fleet ever will. And ours, though uneven, though written with hesitation and revision and shame and hard-won grace, has become clearer across the millennia. We became the ones who return. Return for the lost. Return for the wounded. Return for the truth buried under official stone. Return for the children history tries to abandon. Return to ruined worlds with seed vaults and clean water and patient hands. Return to the scene of our own mistakes, not to deny them, but to repair what can still be repaired. That is why others trust us when they do not fully understand us. That is why some fear us. Because there is very little in this universe more formidable than a being that has suffered, learned from suffering, and chosen compassion without surrendering strength. Compassion with strength changes the balance of history. It refuses the old bargain. It says mercy is not weakness. It says protection is not passivity. It says gentleness can survive in armored hands. That, more than our weapons or our science, is what altered the fate of empires when humanity finally took its place among the stars. We did not arrive as the oldest. We arrived as the unfinished. And the unfinished, if they remain brave enough to keep refining themselves, are often the most disruptive force in any age. Because finished things defend themselves. Unfinished things grow. So what did we become? We became a bridge between the creature and the conscience, between the tribe and the cosmos, between the fire circle and the starship, between the handprint on cave stone and the signal crossing intergalactic dark. We became continuity. We became proof that origin does not imprison destiny. We became the answer to every ancestor who ever looked upward and wondered whether the universe was empty of meaning. No, it was waiting for witnesses. It was waiting for builders. It was waiting for a species foolish enough to love fragile things and stubborn enough to drag that love across light years. It was waiting for us. And still, after all this time, after all our victories and ruins and remakings, after all the names we have been called and all the names we have earned, I think the truest thing that can be said about humanity is not that we conquered the stars. It is that we carried the fire with us and finally learned what it was for. Not domination, not glory, not the old childish fantasy of standing above creation with a flag in our hand. The fire was always for this: to see one another clearly, to keep one another warm, to light the path forward when the map ends, to pass it on. That is what we became. Not perfect, not pure, but worthy of the distance, worthy of the inheritance of dust and thunder that made us, worthy of the dead who believed the future should exist even if they would never see it, worthy, at our best, of the trust placed in us by those who came before and by those who will come after. So if you ask me now, after all the ages, after all the graves, after all the worlds, what humanity became, I will give you the only answer large enough to hold the truth. We became the species that remembered the dark, carried the light anyway, and chose, over and over, against every cruelty of history, to become more than survival. We became human on purpose.